Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for a super special video. So this weekend, wrapping up in the middle of the night last night, was Pro Tour Hour of Devastation, and we're going to take a couple minutes today and talk about everything Pro Tour Hour of Devastation. Basically, wrap up the event. So we're going to talk about the big decks that were heavily played and did well. We're going to talk about some surprising decks, under the radar decks that look pretty sweet, and a little bit about the most played Hour of Devastation cards from the event. So we had a lot to cover, which means we should probably jump right into it. So first off, we have the big decks. We're going to talk about the 5 most played decks and how they performed at the Pro Tour. Number 1 is Ramanop Red. Mono Red Aggro. This is not only the deck that won the Pro Tour, so congrats to PVDDR on his Pro Tour win with Ramanop Red, but it was also the most played deck at Pro Tour Hour of Devastation, and the deck looked really good. It was very impressive. It put 6 players, counting 1 player that was splashing a little bit of black, into the top 8. It was the most played deck on day 1. It put up good numbers across the board, and then it won the whole tournament. So next week, when you go to your FNM, if you're playing on Magic Online, you should expect to see a lot of efficient red creatures and have a plan for dealing with the efficient red creatures. The 2 big things with this deck that we kind of learned is that Hazoret the Fervent is actually pretty insane. This was like the key card in the deck. It was the big finisher. It stole a lot of games out of nowhere. So Hazoret went from being maybe the worst god or the most disrespected god from Amonkhet to being the most played god at Amonkhet and one of the best cards in the best deck at Pro Tour Hour of Devastation. The other big takeaway was Ramanop Ruins is insane. So one of the neat things we saw with this deck, if you think back to when we played 2-tick red, we were going very low to the ground. 20 lands, trying to get in as much damage as possible, trying to mitigate the chance of flooding out. That's the problem with Mono Red Aggro, is if you draw too many lands, you lose. Like, we talked about it a lot with that deck. We want 3 lands. If we ever get to 4 or 5, every additional land we draw, our odds of winning goes down. Ramanop Ruin solves that problem so well because you can play 23 lands, 24 lands, play a bunch of deserts, and if you flood out, it's actually a good thing. Like, it's fine because you turn your lands into more damage to finish off the game, which makes you less likely to get these 1-land openers where you're gonna mulligan a ton. Instead, you can keep kind of land heavy hands and trust that your Ramanop Ruins and your desert plan is gonna close out the game. So that is Ramanop Red. Next up, out of our big decks at Pro Tour Hour of Devastation, we have Green-Black Constrictor. So this is a deck that's been around for a while, and as you can see looking at the list, it's relatively untouched by Hour of Devastation. It's pretty much one of the Kaladesh block decks in the format. And this is a deck that made it all the way to the finals, ended up losing to Paulo, was Sam Party with Green-Black Constrictor. But it came into day 1 as the 3rd most played deck in the field. Ended up being one of the best performing decks. If you really dig into the numbers, Ramanop Red was good, maybe hurt a little bit because it had so many players of varying skill level. Green-Black Constrictor, by the numbers, was one of the 2 best decks. Even though Ramanop Red had so many players in the top 8 and stuff, if you really dig into the numbers, the deck performed very well, and even though it lost in the finals, it did beat some Ramanop Red players along the way, and apparently has a reasonable matchup. That's one of the reasons that Sam Party played Green-Black Constrictor, was because he felt like it had a good matchup against the red decks, which he thought would be heavily played, and he was right and rewarded for it. So if you're looking for a deck that can compete with Mono Red at your next FNM and is gonna most likely survive rotation. If you look at this list, you lose like some lands, Kalidas, but really this is a Kaladesh block deck that's almost certainly gonna survive rotation. So if you want a deck that isn't Mono Red, can compete with Mono Red, maybe beat Mono Red and survive rotation, this might be a good place for you to start looking for your next standard deck. I mentioned that there were 2 really good non-Mono Red decks that by the numbers were the best decks in the format. Green-Black Constrictor, and the second one was Mono-Black Zombies. And Mono-Black Zombies started as the 2nd most played deck at Pro Tour Hour of Devastation, ended up putting 1 player into the top 8, so it is the 3rd top 8 deck. There were only 3 different decks in the top 8, but Zombies was one of them. And really, this deck is almost exactly like the list we saw last Pro Tour at Pro Tour Amonkhet. Very few changes, but this is another deck that apparently has a pretty good game against the mono red deck. That's a reason to play this deck. The reason I'm not higher on this deck is a deck you should pick up for your FNM and stuff if you don't already have the pieces. Like, if you have the pieces, it's great, go for it. The problem is, a lot of key zombies are rotating with Ixalan, so it's a little risky to spend a bunch of money on Relentless Deads, on Crypt Breakers, on Diregraph Colossuses, when so many things are going to be rotating this fall. I think zombies might still be around. We still got Dread Wonder, still got Liliana's Mastery, still have Lord of the Accursed, have Emmet Eternal as a possible fill-in, maybe some more stuff from Ixalan, potentially, but I'm a little bit sketch out to tell you to spend your hard-earned money on mono black zombies, even though it seems very well positioned right now, and put up a really good performance at Pro Tour Hour of Devastation. We have two more decks that kind of round out the top 5 decks at Pro Tour Hour of Devastation. One is our old favorite, MARDU Vehicles, and unlike Ramanop Red, Green Black Constrictor and Mono Black Zombies, MARDU Vehicles, while it was heavily played, 4th most played deck coming into the event on day 1, it only put up an okay performance. It's really hard to say a whole lot. It wasn't horrible. It didn't have a horrible performance where it just completely fell apart, but it also wasn't great. It was kind of just average. So I think that right now, MARDU Vehicles is definitely behind Mono Red, but also behind Green Black Constrictor and Mono Black Zombies. You could argue that maybe it's in the 4th, 5th, 6th best deck in standard range, somewhere in that range, but right now, it doesn't feel like MARDU Vehicles is the best deck in the format, and it might not even be tier 1. It might be falling down to the 2nd tier of deck. So if you have this deck, it's still playable. It didn't get blown out and put up a horrible performance, but it wasn't a great performance either. So we'll have to watch and see what happens with MARDU Vehicles moving forward. I did want to mention this sweet build by Ralph Levy that you can see on screen. Glitness Crane, really cool addition, gives the deck another good blocker against the mono red decks. It comes down on turn 2. There's a lot of 2-1s in the mono red deck, or even 1-1s that Glitness Crane can block. So it's a pretty neat piece of tech to see the main deck Glitness Cranes as a way to fight against the mono red decks. But even with those changes, and this was the best performing MARDU Vehicles deck, so maybe look towards that if you do want to keep playing the deck, maybe the Splash Blue Glitness Crane build. But even with that change, not a great performance from MARDU Vehicles. The last of our big 5 decks at Pro Tour Hour of Devastation, Blue-Red Control. So there was a lot of hype about Blue-Red Control when Hour of Devastation released, partly because of Hour of Devastation, but unfortunately for Control fans out there, the deck pretty much fell flat. It put up an okay day 1 performance, but it kinda got crushed by all the aggressive decks on day 2. It feels like it has a really bad matchup against Ramanop Red, and when everyone's playing red decks and being super aggressive, getting to Nicole Bolas's and Torrential Gearhulks is not exactly the place you want to be. So maybe there's a way to tweak the numbers and make that matchup a little better, but I think for now, Control is probably going to have to sit on the shelf as we wait for rotation this fall. I also briefly wanted to mention a couple other decks. So these are decks that didn't make the top 5 but are worth talking about because they have been hyped or discussed heading into the event. First, we have the Ramp deck with Hour of Promise. The finish for the Ramp decks were mediocre. It's another deck kind of like Control that seemed like it kind of struggled to keep up with the mono red decks. Just a little bit slow, and even if you do all your ramping and get to an Ulamog, there's no reason you don't just lose on the backswing to Earthshaker Kenras and on-crop crashers, making it so your Ulamog can't block. So it feels like it's in a rough place at the moment, although there's a lot of power there, and there might be ways of making it better. A lot of players were playing big expensive sweepers like Hour of Devastation instead of more copies of Kozilek's Return, so there might be a way to tweak the numbers a little bit and improve the matchup, but for now, it seems like a tough format for Green-Red Ramp to really compete. Then the biggest disappointments of the tournament were the 2 blue-white decks. God-Pharaoh's Gift, super hype heading into Pro Tour Hour of Devastation. The deck was just awful. It was very, very bad. I think 19 players started with the deck, and only 2 of them ended up posting a winning record in Standard, which is pretty miserable considering the amount of hype that the deck's getting. I feel like the pieces are still there for a good God-Pharaoh's Gift deck eventually, but the format's not really in a place. Lots of people playing Graveyard Hates. We saw main deck Scavenger Grounds in a lot of decks. We saw a lot of Crook of Condemnation's one of the most played Hour of Devastation cards in the format, so people were prepared for God-Pharaoh's Gift, and it seems like the combination of aggressive red decks and sideboard hate focused on the graveyard is going to keep God-Pharaoh's Gift down. The other blue-white deck that people were talking about was the Ketra's Monument deck. It was performing well on the SCG Tour, and it was actually even more disappointing than the God-Pharaoh's Gift deck. Started with a similar number of players. A single person posted a winning performance out of, I believe, 18 players that started with the deck. So blue-white Monument, kind of a big fall from grace after being the talk of the SCG Tour over the last few weeks. Just didn't really have what it takes to compete at the Pro Tour level. And last but not least, a deck that did do pretty well, but a little bit under the radar, the Teamer Energy decks. While it wasn't heavily played, the players that did play Teamer Energy put up good performances, didn't reach the top 8, but Teamer Energy apparently still good. So if you have a Teamer Energy deck, by all means keep running it. It seems like it's in a fairly good spot, even though it wasn't heavily played at Pro Tour Hour of Devastation. So let's move on from the big, heavily played decks and talk about some of the sweetest decks to show up. So in all honesty, there wasn't a ton of spice at Pro Tour Hour of Devastation. We saw a lot of old favorites, green-black Constrictors, Mardu vehicles, mono-black zombies, Teamer Energies, those type of decks. We also saw the red deck, of course, which is a newish deck, but not really an off-the-wall deck. We knew it was there. It's been performing well recently. But if you really dig down into the numbers and the big list of decks that got at least 6 wins, 6 and 4 better in standard, there is a few spicy decks. So we're going to talk about 3 of my favorite spicy decks. Not going to do a full deck tech because of time issues. If you want to see the list, you can follow the link in the description to kind of check it out. But we might have full deck techs on some of them in the future. First off, we have blue-red gifts. And this deck, I mean, we're just talking about how God-Pharaoh's Gift didn't put up a good performance, but this deck is super insane. It's a very different take on the blue-red gift deck. You get a bunch of cyclers to fill your graveyard. You have insolent neonates to fill the graveyard and kind of generate that value with God-Pharaoh's Gift. We only have a few actual God-Pharaoh's Gifts. One of them, instead we're relying on Gate of the Afterlife to actually get our God-Pharaoh's Gift out. If it dies, we can get it back from the graveyard. My favorite part of this deck, though, is the combo kill. So what we're really trying to set up is getting a Marionette Master on the battlefield from our God-Pharaoh's Gift, which lets us make it a 7/7 if we want to. Or it's a 4/4, which is also fine, coming along with some servos. We have hollow ones that we can hopefully cast for free as we're discarding cards. And then with our 7/7 Marionette Master, we can just sacrifice 3 artifacts, or I guess it'll be 4 artifacts because of how the numbers work, but sacrifice artifacts to Metalwork Colossus and drain our opponent out of the game with Marionette Master. So we have this really unique, cool combo kill involving God-Pharaoh's Gift getting back Marionette Master, Hollow One sacked by Metalwork Colossus, kill our opponent out of nowhere. So I really like that, because even if the opponent gums up the board, has blockers and disruption, all we need to do is get back 1 Marionette Master, and we can theoretically just combo kill our opponent without ever attacking. Our second under the radar deck, we have green-black Pummeler, and we've seen electrostatic Pummeler decks before, but they've almost always been green-red based. Sometimes straight green-red, sometimes Teamer. This one has a big twist on it. It's mostly mono-green, a little bit of black for removal and glint sleeve siphoners, but the sweet thing about this one is, not only do we have the full 4 electrostatic Pummelers for the combo kill, but we also have Dream Stealer, which kind of works like Pummelers 5 and 6. Like, the deck really wants a Pummeler, but if we can get down a Dream Stealer and throw a larger-than-life or Blossoming Defense at it, yeah, we don't just win the game like with Pummeler, but we're gonna empty our opponent's hand of cards, which means it's gonna be really hard for us not to win the game as the game goes along. So as soon as turn 4, we can potentially just mind twist our opponent into oblivion. So going black with Pummeler is a really neat twist. We did see a few of the green-red based builds there, but this green-black based build is super spicy and pretty interesting. So if you're looking for a way to tweak your Pummeler deck, which we've featured on Budget Magic before, so maybe you have it sitting around, this is an interesting way to kind of make that into a new-ish style of deck without investing a ton of money. Last but not least on our spicy deck list, we have a deck that's not only spicy, but also almost in the budget range, just over $100 in the paper world, and that is green-black Aristorites. And this deck, it's kind of been around. We've seen green-black Cryptolithrite decks before, but this one has some interesting twists. The biggest addition, which is super sweet, is Oketra's Monument. It might seem counterintuitive to play Oketra's Monument Monument in a non-white deck. It doesn't make our creatures cheaper, but it generates a ton of tokens, which then make a ton of mana with Cryptolith Rites, so we can activate Dustwatch a ton of times, get even more creatures. Eventually, we flip around to Westville Abbey, kill our opponent. We also have Blood Artists or Zulaport Cutthroats to drain our opponent out, some Bantu, some other Aristocrat style stuff. So a pretty spicy, almost budget list to come out of the Pro Tour as well. So lastly today, I want to wrap up by talking about Hour of Devastation at Pro Tour Hour of Devastation. So what cards from Hour of Devastation itself had an impact? Number one is Abrade, the single most played Hour of Devastation card. And this was actually the single most played card overall, beating out Fatal Push as the number one most played card in the format. Played in the mono red decks, but also a lot of other decks. Basically, if your deck has red mana, you were playing Abrade. So this was kind of the all-star, I guess, as far as Hour of Devastation was concerned. But after that, things get a little bit sketchy. Like, there's a lot of deserts seeing play, but these aren't really exciting cards. Yes, Ramunap Ruins is key to the mono red deck. If Nerd Redland shows up in the zombie list, these lands are powerful, but they're not really, I don't know, exciting like you would see a flashy new mythic or something. The other group of cards that saw a lot of play, the mono red cards, including Adamant Eternal in this list, because the main place Adamant Eternal would played was a version of the mono red deck that was splashing just a little bit of black for some different removal and for Adamant Eternal. Wasn't really showing up in zombies as far as we've seen. And then finally, the sideboard cards. So out of the top 10 cards from Hour of Devastation at Pro Tour Hour of Devastation, it's not a lot of spicy stuff. It's basically mono red cards, the deserts, and then sideboard cards. Chandra's Defeat, good in a red versus red field. Crook of Condemnation, hates on all the graveyard decks. Doomfall gives you a Thoughtseize / removal spell. So if we get beyond that, the most played cards from Hour of Devastation were Hour of Devastation itself, Champion of Wits, Hour of Promise, and God-Pharaoh's Gift. The problem is, take Hour of Devastation, which was the most played out of this group. There were 24 total copies out of the decks that posted at least a 6-4 or better record. The problem is, the maximum number of copies you could have if you were a 4 of in every deck is over 500. It was 536. So 24 is actually a tiny amount. Compare that to like Abrade that was over 200 copies or something. So these were extremely fringe. Champion of Wits was like 16 copies, Hour of Promise. All these cards, like, yeah, they showed up, but they were in tiny fractions of decks. So overall, apart from mono red being dominant, the deserts being good, and some sideboard cards, Hour of Devastation didn't really have a huge impact on Pro Tour Hour of Devastation. While the red deck did redeem it to some extent, we still saw tons of Hour of Devastation cards because of the deserts, because of Earthshaker Kenra. I'm a little disappointed that some of the flashier, more exciting rares, the God-Pharaoh's Gift, the Hour of Promise, the Champion of Wits, didn't really do anything at their namesake Pro Tour. So it looks like, apart from the mono red deck and some sweet sideboard cards and the desert lands, of course, Hour of Devastation, the set, might have to wait for Pro Tour Ixalan in standard rotation to really have a chance to shine in standard. So anyway, that's our wrap up for Pro Tour Hour of Devastation. Hopefully this was helpful. Let me know if you're interested in this. If this is something that you want to see in the future, we can try to keep doing these video wrap-ups for Pro Tours. So yeah, let me know if you like it. Let me know your thoughts on the Pro Tour. What deck was your favorite? What did you think of the field? Did you like the mono red deck? Is there too much of the mono red deck? Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.